Welcome everyone to the Psych Talk today. Um, Today's talk is going to be on what are the problems of perfectionism. Now, the purpose of the talk today is not it's not to criticize or attack anybody that identifies as a perfectionist. A lot of us have perfectionistic tendencies, maybe, or standards that we want to meet in our lives, and that's perfectly okay. So, perfectionism in colloquial sort of conversation, when we talk about it with other people, tends to be viewed often positively, or when it's viewed negatively, it seems to be often maybe in a humorous manner. But in terms of when we look at people who are successful or we might admire, often people will come out and say, well, I have very high standards, I expect excellence, and that's how I've achieved what I have. And I guess the purpose of today's talk maybe is to encourage a little bit more of a balanced view on that, to reflect on some of the potentially unhelpful parts of perfectionism, to hopefully give you an understanding so that you can reflect on your own practices around perfectionism and which ones are helpful, which ones may not be so helpful, to sort of draw the line between those. And just as a general encouragement for people to challenge unhelpful perfectionism when they come up against it, whether in themselves or whether they see people who they care about perhaps engaging in unhelpful perfectionism. So, as always, this talk is intended to provide information and education only. It's not meant for diagnosis or treatment or anything like that. Just because you identify with a lot of things I'm talking about doesn't mean you have any sort of disorder or anything's wrong with you. However, if you are experiencing distress or are concerned or want more information on the topic, please see a health professional or mental health professional in your local area. That can be a doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, mental health nurse, school counsellor, social worker, etc. So, as a way of introduction, perfectionism tends in society to be linked with sort of high standards. And a lot of people consider having high standards as a good thing, a positive thing, because in circumstances it can be. Having high standards is a way to motivate yourself to achieve things that maybe might seem initially difficult or require a lot of perseverance and time. Having high standards can help with things like self-discipline, so that you know to sacrifice, for instance, enjoyment now for achievement later. A lot of people link having high standards or perfectionism with this sort of striving for excellence. So it's sort of an attitude that people define as quite helpful in maybe their job performance or their performance in a particular hobby or a sport. And a lot of people see it as doing your best. And perfectionism is usually an internal force. It's usually an intrinsic force, an internal motivating force. And again, even though it often involves putting pressure on yourself to meet those standards, that can also be a good thing in terms of helping you meet your goals, helping you stick to your values and your beliefs. Having high standards is not, it can be useful. And especially when in moments where you're able to meet those standards, it can be very satisfying. It can be very, it can give you a great sense of achievement to meet goals that you set for yourself, that are quite a high bar, that are difficult, that are going to challenge yourself. When you're able to meet those goals, it can seem very satisfying and can give you a sense of achievement. The issue sometimes with perfectionism is that there are helpful and unhelpful parts, and it can be quite difficult to draw the line between a healthy pursuit of achievable excellence, we'll call it, and an unhealthy striving for unrealistic perfection in our lives. So before I go into necessarily what is unhelpful about perfectionism, just a quick sort of definition of what I want to see perfectionism as in this particular talk, because there's lots of different ways to talk about perfectionism. There's lots of different definitions of it. The definition I've chosen is from the Center for Clinical Interventions, where I get a lot of my information for my talks. And it has three components, right? So the important thing to understand about these components is they can be for yourself. Often they will be for and towards yourself. But there can also be expectations of others in terms of standards. So the first component of perfectionism that I want to talk about is the relentless striving for quite high standards, objectively high standards, based on what your situation, your level of competency, and all of that, that are quite demanding on a personal level. So they're demanding about your capacities, things that you have control over. So we'll refer to this as unrelenting standards, right? They're constantly a part of your experience. They're unrelenting, but also they're quite high, objectively quite high. And they're standards that you have a certain expectation to meet, internally expect to meet. The second component is that you judge your self-worth in a large part based on your ability to achieve the unrelenting standards. So perfectionism is not just about having standards and being able to fail and being okay with that, right? Otherwise, the standards that you're setting are not necessarily goals, they're more dreams or wishes, right? So we're talking about perfectionism in the sense that you believe you are capable of reaching these standards if you challenge yourself hard enough. You genuinely believe that, and because you genuinely believe that, there is a price or a cost of failure to your identity and your self-judgment, right? Failure means something to you. It means maybe I didn't try hard enough, I didn't do enough work, whatever it might be, right? So there is a part of your self-worth on the line with these unrelenting standards. And the third component is that these unrelenting standards, in striving for them, there are costs generally. There are costs with time, there are costs with maybe material costs, with getting the knowledge, getting resources that you need to meet these goals. There are costs in terms of maybe opportunities to do other things. So there might be social costs, there might be relationship costs, whatever it might be. These goals are not easily achievable, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be calling them high standards. They wouldn't be goals. So those are the sort of three components, that they're unrelenting standards, that you judge your self-worth in some part by, in terms of whether you succeed or fail, and that there is some sort of cost to striving for these standards. So again, these can be helpful or unhelpful, right? This type of perfectionism can be helpful or unhelpful. As I mentioned, a lot of successful people, or people that society would deem to be successful, will identify themselves as perfectionists. They will have expected perfection. People like Steve Jobs consistently identified himself as a perfectionist, for instance. So a lot of people that society will say, or judges as successful, got to those points because they had unrelenting standards. They were able to meet them despite putting in a lot of effort and maybe sacrificing a lot of costs. And you know, sometimes we read their stories and sometimes those costs are included, but often we don't see the things they had to give up in striving for that excellence. But whatever they might have had to give up, usually when they are interviewed or that sort of thing, they will say, well, it was worth it to get where I am today. So often that kind of perfectionism will be portrayed as positive, and rightly so. Perfectionism can be a positive motivating factor for you to be your best self, for you to do your best. You know, ambition, setting ambitious goals is not necessarily a bad thing if it helps to motivate you to strive for excellence. However, problems with perfectionism can arise in a lot of ways, right? Perfectionism can go wrong. So one of the ways is when the goals are unreasonable, unachievable, or unsustainable. Okay, so and I mean, I'll go through the ways it can be a problem just very briefly now, and I'll go through them in more detail later. I think that might be a better way to do it. So problems can arise when your goals are unreasonable, unachievable, or unsustainable. Perfectionism can be particularly problematic if your self-worth is very closely tied to your ability to achieve excellence. Particularly if accidents or mistakes happen. So if not everything goes your way, if external factors outside of your control impact your ability to meet your standards, often self-criticism comes in and makes it very difficult for you to feel good about yourself or think positively about yourself. Right? So I'll go through those in a bit more detail, but firstly, I guess the part that I want to go through is, well, why would we want to be perfectionists, right? And, you know, I've listed a bunch of reasons why we might want to be perfectionists, but on a personal level, this is sort of an invitation to to have a bit of a self-reflection on, okay, well, what does perfectionism mean to me, and why do I value perfectionism? Why do I value having high standards? Because of course, we very rarely do things that are purposefully harmful to us. Particularly our brains. Our brains don't decide necessarily to wake up and do harmful things or unhelpful things. Our brain tries to be helpful. So there are certainly helpful parts to perfectionism that our brain identifies, and that's why it maintains perfectionism in people who do identify themselves to be that. So, why do we want to be perfectionists? Well, as I said before, a lot of successful people, again, I use success as, capitalist societies deemed to be successful, so rich people, wealthy people. A lot of these people either outwardly say they're perfectionists or seem to be perfectionists in terms of their striving to be excellent and having high standards. So pursuing excellence and high standards can often be seen as a recipe for success, and of course, being rich and wealthy is attractive to us. So that would be a reason to want to strive to have high standards, because we want to be successful. And identifying as a perfectionist can include a lot of positive self-concept. So things like, I like to do things well. I get pleasure out of achieving what other people can't do. Right? So these are things that you might identify in terms of your self-concept that are positive, that make you feel good about yourself. Perfectionism makes me feel special. That I have a high bar that maybe I don't see other people having, or my standards being higher than other people's. I feel like I'm achieving unique things. I like knowing I've done everything that I can. Right? I like knowing that I've tried everything I can. I like knowing that I've done my best every single time that I try something. That's not a bad thing. That's positive. Or it might be that I like being the best. And again, that's not necessarily a negative thing. If you have the capacity to be the best in a field, let's say, the Olympics are on right now, right? For a lot of those athletes, they will identify as perfectionists in their chosen sport. And what better feeling for them than at being the best in the world, than having a gold medal for their achievements, for their accomplishments. But similarly, you can strive for perfection in your craft, in your work. Maybe the promotion that you get is a sign that you are the best out of your current cohort, and therefore you were chosen to be promoted. Maybe it's an exam result that shows you're at the top of the class. That sort of thing, right? It's liking to be the best, again, is not necessarily a negative at all. In fact, it can be quite a positive motivating force for you to put more work in, for you to have the self-discipline to study, that sort of thing, right? For some people, I like being prepared for every possibility. Some people like being organized, they like being neat, they like being prepared, and that is something that means a lot to them. That's something that helps them maybe worry less, that helps them live their life in a more meaningful way, when they can say to themselves, I am prepared for everything. And for some people, I don't like losing. Perfectionism When I strive for excellence, it means I don't lose very much, or at all, because I don't like the feeling of losing. So all of these can be reasons for wanting to have high standards, for wanting to be a perfectionist, and that's fine. So as I said, the purpose of the talk really is to encourage reflection around what perfectionism means to you and what are the positive elements of perfectionism that are helping you strive to be, strive to achieve, strive for excellence. Now, what are some problems with perfectionism? What can be some problems? Well, unrelenting standard. And again, this is not meant to make anybody who identifies as a perfectionist feel bad. That's certainly not the intent of this part. As I said, the purpose of this is to have you reflect on the good parts of perfectionism, but also, hopefully, if there are any negative parts of perfectionism, to be able to identify how they're unhelpful for you so that you can potentially change some of those parts and maintain the parts of perfectionism that are helpful for you. So what could be some problems with perfectionism? Well, unrelenting standards create unrelenting pressure. And unrelenting pressure, when it's unnecessary for the task to be performed, can lead to increased stress and anxiety. That's, I guess, one of the biggest issues with perfectionism is that if we remember back to the first talk we had on the link between anxiety / stress and performance, in which, with the curve, too much anxiety and stress decreases your performance, right? If you're too anxious, if you're too stressed, if there's too much pressure on you, you cannot perform to your optimal level. Human beings operate under certain amounts of stress. Everyone's different, of course, but they operate optimally under certain amounts of stress. If you are way too wired, way too stressed, feel overwhelmed with pressure, you are not going to perform well. So, perfectionism becomes a problem if, unrelenting standards are going to create pressure. If that pressure is motivating you to go to your optimal performance, great. But if it's pushing you towards an unhelpful amount of stress and anxiety in your life, that can be unhelpful. Also, unrelenting standards create expectations. So, at some point, if you say, I've done my best on a project, or on whatever it might be, on an exam, at some point your best becomes the point of expectation, right? So at some point you're striving for something more than what you're doing now. You achieve that becomes your new baseline, and your standards go up even more. So what tends to happen with some perfectionists is that at some point they no longer feel the sense of achievement, the sense of satisfaction, the sense of joy at attaining the standard that they originally set. So there becomes this constant need for revision to do even better than before. And again, there are a lot of catchphrases out there to say, as long as you're, don't strive to be the best, but just strive to be better than you were yesterday, right? There's a lot of variations on that catchphrase, but essentially what it's saying is try to be a better person, or try to do better than you were yesterday or before, or last time. And of course, that's quite inspirational for some people. It might be motivating for some people. And it might seem like a harmless statement. The problem with trying to always be better is it's unrealistic to always outdo yourself in certain things. Right? For some people, you may get to a point where that is the limit of your capacities. Right? If you achieved an A and you didn't get an A plus on a particular piece of assessment, that might be your best. And if you keep striving, if you keep saying, well, that's not good enough, I don't feel like that's I need to improve my standards all the time, well, sometimes that's not realistic. Sometimes that's not achievable. And sometimes it can be really unhelpful to keep expecting that of yourself. That's not to say that you should give up, necessarily. It's that sometimes the constant need to be better is in itself unhelpful and unrealistic. Right? So again, it's not the concept that's the problem. It's the fact that you need to reflect on whether that constant need is helpful for you in that particular situation. Right? If your capacity is limited by certain aspects of your life, maybe certain aspects outside of your control, right? You've only got so much time for certain things. You have to spend time eating and sleeping and socializing and all of that sort of stuff. And maybe you could do better at your work, but that involves sacrificing family time. That involves sacrificing time with your friends. It involves sacrificing sleep and exercise, right? And maybe that's not a positive in general. Maybe those costs are too much. That's the sort of thing that hopefully, even if you identify as a perfectionist, you're able to keep in check, keep reflecting in terms of your standards to say, well, is that a realistic standard given my situation? Rather than saying a blanket, I always need to do better than before, right? Which can be a problem. Because it's not a nice feeling to feel that your best is not enough. And also, as I said before, there are going to be times where you don't meet your standards. There are going to be times where you get, let's say, a mark on a piece of assessment, a mark on an exam, that doesn't meet what you thought you were going to get. There are going to be times where you think you're next in line for a promotion and you don't get that promotion, someone else gets it. There are going to be times, there are going to be athletes who thought they were the best in the world and then they come home with a bronze medal or no medal. What happens then? Right? And this is the part about judging yourself based on unrelenting standards. So if your unrelenting standards and tying them into your self-worth means that you feel like a failure, that's unhelpful. Right? Self-criticism is your brain's way to motivate you. Self-criticism is a learned behavior. It's often modeled by our parents. It's modeled and taught in school by teachers. Criticism is used as a way to motivate people, right? Throughout your life, you will receive a lot of criticism. Sometimes we call the better parts of it constructive criticism, but it's still criticism. And the thing is, you'll hear some people say, "Oh, I am my own biggest critic," as if that is a point of pride in how they operate, in their way of living. And again, none of that is necessarily bad in itself, but it can be unhelpful when your standards are unrelenting, which means at some point you will fail, and when you do fail, the immediate response is to engage in putting yourself down. Putting yourself down all the time is not going to lead to good mental health. Doesn't matter how resilient you are, right? It's not going to be helpful. Now, there is always a balance with everything. So, people that have no aspect of self-criticism in their experience can also, maybe have other problems, right? When sometimes we label those people maybe narcissists. But again, it's the tying of the unrelenting standards and the meeting of those unrelenting standards to yourself, your judgment of yourself, and the other part of this is mistakes and accidents happen, right? Human beings are not perfect even in replicating something that we do. We will still make mistakes, one in every, so many times. If we take an exam 100 times, we're going to get different results on many of those occasions, depending on our mood, what we had for food, interpersonal relationships at the time, right? If you've gone through an argument with somebody, then your partner breaks up with you just before your exam, and then you had something bad to eat for breakfast, and your stomach feels terrible and you're in pain throughout the whole thing, it's going to affect your performance. Similarly, accidents happen as well, outside of your control, right? So if there's no room or leeway between meeting those unrelenting standards and failure, right? There's only I meet it, or I'm a failure, or I failed. Then there's no room for mistakes and accidents, even though those are part of our everyday experience. And tying a mistake or an accident, the result from that, the failure maybe from that, tying those to your identity and to your self-worth can be very self-defeating. So, the costs of being a perfectionist are costs to your well-being. As I said before, increased stress, increased anxiety, and again, this is not for everybody, but research has shown some links between perfectionism and depression, between perfectionism and eating problems, disordered eating, between perfectionism and obsessive compulsive symptoms, insomnia and sleep issues, and even relationship issues. One of the other potential, again, all of these are not in everybody's experience, but one of the other potential issues with perfectionism is that it opens the door very widely for unhelpful thinking styles. If you are a perfectionist for a while, which for most people, perfectionism is not something they can really switch on and off, and also it's something that they will have experienced often from maybe even childhood, but certainly from adolescence onwards. So for many people, perfectionism is a part of them. Perfectionism leads to things like should and must statements, right? I should do well in this test. I should be able to get this promotion. I must be top of my class, or I'm a failure. All of those sorts of unhelpful statements. Also with all or nothing thinking, right? All or nothing, black and white thinking. There is only success, otherwise I failed. I have to achieve a particular rank, a particular thing. I have to be perfect in this circumstance, otherwise I've failed, I've lost. And perfectionism often leads to catastrophizing as well. It's the other unhelpful thinking style that's often tied to perfectionism. If I don't meet my unrelenting standards, then, etc., etc. Right? A lot of negative consequences. And there is a big link, whether people, some people might be very aware of this link, and some people might not be, but there is a big link between perfectionism and procrastination. Huge link. One of the quotes, and I'll bring it up early actually, one of the quotes I have from Michael Hyatt, an American author, podcaster and speaker, is, "Perfectionism is the mother of procrastination." And one of the things that people will often say, it varies, of course, around this, but one of the things that people might say is, if I can't do it perfectly, what is the point of even getting started? So I'll talk a little bit more about the link later, just as a segue to next week's talk, which will be on procrastination. But getting back to the cost of being a perfectionist, as I mentioned before very briefly, sometimes we don't just set standards for ourselves. Sometimes we set these standards and we impose these standards on people around us. And that can also be a very big issue. Not always, but it can be. If you think about parenting, right? Maybe not all of us have gone through this, but some of us will have gone through instances where our parents push their unrelenting standards onto us. Right? It might be when we were at school and they expected certain things from us. It might be not even to do with academics, but academics is the most common one, I guess. But maybe they expected us to perform well in a sport that they really enjoyed. They thought we should be good at it, and we didn't perform, and then we get criticized for that. Right? And often the words that they might say to us, or we might say to people around us that we don't think have met the standards that they should, things like, you haven't reached your potential, were you even trying? It can be quite unhelpful from a social perspective, to be overly critical of others, to be holding others to unrelenting standards, right? You can see how that can, be unhelpful. So in terms of sort of the difference between the positive self-concepts that I talked about before, things like, the positive parts of perfectionism makes me feel special, I like being the best, that sort of thing. Some of the negative self-concepts that can be related to perfectionism are things like, well, I blame myself if things aren't done right, no achievement is ever enough, I can't stand it when other people don't do things my way, linked to sometimes I don't trust others to do a good job, so I end up doing everything. and yeah, I have to check and go over my work constantly. I'm just, some people will have, I have to check and go over my work constantly, right? But for other people, that's always revise unrelenting standards. So I have to do more and more just to maintain my image as a high achiever, right? So for some people, there becomes an image that they have about themselves. So that's your self identity, your self concept as a high achiever, right? Or the image that you project to other people. Other people say, oh, you're so smart, you're always so. All right, I think we're back. Um, okay, so one of the other problematic self concepts is that often people have an image as a high achiever. So, what tends to happen with people who let's say you do meet your high standards for a certain period of time or over more often than not, you might have an image with yourself in terms of your identity as a high achiever, or other people might say things like, oh, you're really smart, you always do so well, you're always so perfect. And that can be a pressure in itself to maintain that image. So, you have to, sometimes people feel like they have to do more and more, put, so much more work in, work extra hard, extra long hours, just to maintain that image of being a high achiever. And as I said before, the one of the big ones, one of the big problems with perfectionism is its link with avoidance, procrastination, all those sort of coping strategies for the increased pressure that you feel on you. So, I'm so afraid of failing that I never get started is, I think, a concept that a lot of people might be able to, maybe not always relate to, but in certain circumstances relate to. Right? We start having those unhelpful thoughts around, okay, well, this is the standard that I have to meet. What are the chances of me actually making that standard? And if there are a lot of barriers in the way, if there are a lot of factors that maybe will prevent me from reaching that standard, then there's no point me doing anything less than that standard, because that's just a failure anyway. So, procrastination in the sense of perfectionism can be one of the unhelpful coping strategies, right, for being afraid of failure, being afraid of not being able to reach your high standards. But also, the increased stress and anxiety and the increased pressure from perfectionism can lead to other unhelpful strategies as well, right? So, often it will be things related to needing to relax or needing to do something enjoyable to decrease that stress and anxiety. So when we feel pressured, going to comfort eat, going to socialize, maybe watching YouTube or watching TV shows is a way to decrease that stress and anxiety. But as we all know, those activities are not helpful for actually getting our work done or meeting those standards that we need to meet, right? And that's where avoidance and procrastination can lead to that sort of vicious cycle of feeling like, well, I'm never gonna, this is never gonna be perfect. I'm never gonna get this done to the standard that I expect anyway. I feel a lot of pressure. I'm going to go do something else for now. And then you come back to your project and you've got even less time now. And the stress and anxiety is even greater than it was before. So feeling like you won't be good enough prevents you from getting started is often what people can feel when they feel the need to procrastinate. And the plan is for the next talk to be on procrastination, to sort of be linked to this one. I know that, again, there's a lot of negative aspects that I've talked about to perfectionism. However, this talk is not meant to be again, as I said, an attack on anybody that identifies as a perfectionist. It's merely meant to say that often when we think about perfectionism, often when we talk about perfectionism in society, it's seen as a positive. However, there are negatives to perfectionism. There are unhelpful parts to perfectionism, and to be aware of those. Again, the general disclaimer that I have is that these talks are intended to provide information and education only. They're not meant for diagnostic or treatment purposes. If you are experiencing distress or are concerned or want more information, please visit a health professional or mental health professional in your local area. And just to finish off, as usual, we'll go through some quotes that I quite like. They're a little bit relevant to the topic. So the first one is from Adam Osborne. He's a British-American author, publisher, and computer designer, who said, "The most valuable thing you can make is a mistake. You can't learn anything from being perfect." And that sort of talks to, the issue, one of the issues of perfectionism, which is that if you always achieve, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And if being perfect doesn't allow you to see some of the flaws in your methodology or ways you could use your time more efficiently or anything like that, sometimes perfectionism doesn't allow for reflection. Sometimes it's mistakes, and usually it's mistakes and failures that give us the most motivation to reflect on ourselves. What are the processes that we went through? What can we do better? Right. The second quote is from Maria Shriver, former First Lady of California, and also a journalist and author. And she says, "Perfectionism doesn't make you feel perfect. It makes you feel inadequate." Right, so that one sort of speaks to the fact that often with perfectionism, it becomes an expectation that you'll meet your standards, in which case you no longer feel the satisfaction or the joy of meeting that expectation. All you're feeling then is that either I've failed and therefore I'm inadequate, or, okay, I've done this, now I need to go to the next level. And the last quote, a very short one, is from Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Operating Officer of Facebook. And this is, she says, "Done is better than perfect." Right, so that's a little dig at procrastination as well, to say that, getting something finished, getting something submitted, handed in, ticked off the checklist is more important than spending so much time doing that thing perfectly. Done is better than perfect. And just before I end, I want to credit the Center for Clinical Interventions. They are they have an online presence where they have a lot of resources around mental health, and I get a decent chunk of my information from them as well. Thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you in the next Psych Talk.